Alright, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. We've been covering a few serial killer cases recently on the channel, and the thing that we talk about the most when examining serial killer cases, well, in fact, there are two things. One is some of the solutions that we can talk about, hopefully so these things will not happen again in the future, but another one is just what's the overall mindset of the person that's going on? And what are the contributing psychological factors that lead to somebody committing these types of actions? And if we're going to talk about serial killers, we should definitely include the Zodiac killer into this. Because the Zodiac is a case that I find it has an enormous amount of irregularities. And this could really tie into some of the theories about the Zodiac killer's identity. We've covered countless Zodiac uploads on this channel. So the things that I noticed, though, when we were kind of presenting a presentation on each one of the suspects, whether it's Richard Gaikowski or Arthur Lee Allen or Ross Sullivan or Lawrence Kane, we're going through a lot of them. They have a lot of similarities between the suspects, and we've been really focusing in on the individual and the personality. But let's just kind of look at some of the overall features of the Zodiac and the murders and just what has been committed, because there's a big thing to say about this, so please stay with me. The first thing I would say is the Zodiac was horribly inconsistent, right? Is that what you would expect, actually? Inconsistent? Yes, inconsistent. All kinds of varying across the way for the Zodiac killer. I mean, different methods of execution, sometimes wearing the Zodiac hood, sometimes not. And not to mention, the deviation from the pattern with the Paul Stine murder. However, though, there are some historical tendencies among serial killers to do things like that. But when I said inconsistent, somebody recommended that I check out the suspect, Robert Christian Hansen, as a potential Zodiac killer suspect. He was the serial killer from Alaska, the butcher baker, and I don't personally believe that there's a substantial connection there between, or that Robert Hansen is not the Zodiac killer. But the first thing that I saw when I was reading up on him was he executed most of his victims with a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. And I just began to think, hey, wait a second, we're dealing with serial killers. That's an enormous differentiation. The Zodiac did not execute his victims with a rifle. And then I began to think, wait, well, the Zodiac is rather kind of inconsistent about how the murders were committed. And not all those Zodiac murders were committed by by shooting even. The final Lover's Lane murder, which included the death of Cecilia Ann Shepard, that was done with stab wounds. And then Paul Stine, of course, wasn't even a Lover's Lane issue at all. That was, of course, murdering a taxi driver. So what you see is that there is a different methods, different types of locations. Sometimes wearing the hood, sometimes not. Sometimes targeting Lover's Lanes. The final time, there was not. Definitely, I would say, though, there probably is a rather consistent animosity toward women. Definitely there is some type of feeling of rejection, because in the Texarkana Moonlight Murders from 1946, we also had the exact same dynamic. 5 people were murdered in Texarkana, Texas, and on the Arkansas border in 1946 from someone wearing a hood. And the thing is with that one, the killer differentiated from the pattern with the 5th murder victim. Once again, he tried to murder more victims than that, the same way the Zodiac killer did, but some survived, ending it up with 5 murdered victims. And with the 5th murder victim, he differentiated from the pattern. Instead of targeting Lover's Lanes, the way that the Zodiac did as well, instead of targeting Lover's Lanes, he targeted someone in their home listening to a radio program. And what I've said is, either the Zodiac killer must have studied the Texarkana Moonlight Murders and thought, okay, this is how I can do better than this guy. I can one-up him. I can be way better than him. He used that as kind of a blueprint or a model and thought that he could be a better serial killer than that guy. I mean, like, as grim as that sounds. Or that there are just some very similar psychological factors that go into someone creating this type of serial killer mindset. Like the psychology between those two individuals, the Phantom killer from 1946 and the Zodiac killer from 1968-69, there must be some very similar psychology going on, because those similarities are undeniable. So when we're looking at this, though, one of the things, though, that might explain some of the Zodiac's kind of odd things, sometimes using handguns, sometimes using knives, murdering Paul Stine, the taxi driver, is this the work of a group murder theory? We've talked about this on the channel. We did a couple uploads about the group murder theory, and there's a reason about why I did a couple uploads as well, just posing the question, did Richard Gaikowski murder Darlene Ferrin but not the other victims? Because I was like, it just seems like such an inconsistent setup. It does not seem like this is the same psychology of one person. And I would just ask that as like kind of like, that's our first challenge question for the day. Do you think that the psychological factors of the Zodiac killer seem like they're coming from one person or more than one person? With the Richard Gaikowski thing, no, I don't personally subscribe to that theory anymore, that he murdered Darlene Ferrin, because it seems like Darlene Ferrin's sister was promoting a lot of disinfo about the case to try and get on television shows and such. In short, she was spreading misinformation about the Zodiac murders. Not to mention that someone left an excellent comment about how the first murder of the Lake Herman Road murders in 1968 were not widely published, so it's very implausible that somebody would have been reading up on the Zodiac at that point and really tried to kind of act as sort of a copycat and take credit, or allow the Zodiac killer to take credit for his own murder. No, I don't believe that Richard Gaikowski murdered Darlene Ferrin and then the other murders were committed by somebody else. But there was something that I noticed, and why are we noticing it in that way? We might be dealing with multiple people. I mean, like, because what the reason why there are patterns with serial killers is they find a method that works. Their ambition is to kill people. So they have developed a method that allows them to do that successfully. The explanations that people have for differentiating from patterns are things like Wayne Williams or even Gary Ridgway that we were talking about last time. For the examples that, like, they watch the news, they read the papers, oh, the police are investigating this, they've caught on to what I'm doing. Wayne Williams very specifically changed his pattern so he to avoid capture. Gary Ridgway, the Green River killer, would do this all the time. He would, like, intentionally differentiate, so once again the police would not be able to capture him as easily. But, like, is that what's going on with the Zodiac killer? Is he somebody who is, like, trying to intentionally be bizarre? And is he intentionally trying to differentiate just so that he can throw off investigators? I personally am not quite sure about that, because if you look at some of the things that we have, what is the biggest motivation to switch from handguns to stab wounds? I mean, those things aren't necessarily going to help you avoid capture. We can say that everything about the Zodiac killer is very methodical. I would admit that that's a very big consistency. You might think that the Paul Stine murder is not very methodical, but he got away with it. I mean, he committed a murder just in, Washington Street and Cherry Street, and then just got out of the cab, walked away, has Paul Stine's wallet, bloody fragment of his clothing, completely avoids detection. Witnesses are giving lousy descriptions about him, which includes the police department, because he walks right past them and they thought they were supposed to be looking for a black man, but when in reality it was the Caucasian Zodiac killer. I would say, though, that it feels, though, that, like, most of what we get from the letters and the ciphers, that seems like it's coming from possibly one person. I don't necessarily notice those types of differentiations. We can also say, though, that that the Zodiac killer did not sexually assault the victims, did not target sex workers, And a lot of people think that that could have been something that we should have seen in somebody like Arthur Lee Allen. Arthur Lee Allen was, accused of pedophilia. He was just accused of all types of being a sex maniac, in other words. But do you necessarily see those connections to Arthur Lee Allen in the Zodiac kind of killer psychology? I admit it's somewhat convincing. But a big differentiation from the pattern would be the Kathleen Johns incident, when you have the Zodiac allegedly trying to abduct somebody. And then, that is not just like an accident that people are just thinking is Zodiac. We have the very clear Zodiac message that was written on the car door. We mentioned Sharon Hagen on the channel before, who the profiler, who just said very clearly that she does not believe that the Zodiac killer committed the Kathleen Johns incident. She believes that was a copycat, or that was just, some other guy. He's just trying to masquerade as the Zodiac killer, or writes the message on the car door as a way to distract people from his own actions. We have to say something about that, about the Kathleen Johns incident. We should probably do a whole upload on the Kathleen Johns incident. The Zodiac did not abduct the victims. Look at that. That is not, necessarily a consistent feature. You have a possible abduction. You have people being stabbed. You have some people being shot, sometimes wearing the hood. Look at all of these different things. This really is not typical serial killer behavior. But at the same time, I am willing to kind of admit that there's not a rule book on how to kill people. There isn't this type of instructional manual that you have to follow and just be like, okay, this is how you have to commit murders and this is how you have to avoid detection. I mean, are people not allowed to be different? Are people not allowed to kind of do something that is not typical, that is atypical? But one of the things we have to also say is that we mentioned before, you can't focus too much on unraveling the thinking of a madman, because it's just going to kind of go off in like some type of giant illogical mess that you might never really understand. And that's not even the exact thing that we have talked about on the channel, about really like what is the person thinking when they are doing what they're doing. No, not quite. What are the motivations that are leading people to do these things? I am so much more focused on things like that. And with the Zodiac killer, what we can say is that the Zodiac is someone who's an inconsistent serial killer. All types of different things are coming out, and you're just seeing a very, very large array of behaviors, of actions, of creating a gimmick. And I mean, I know I asked it once before, but it's like, sometimes do you think that this is the work of two people or three people? Like they kind of created the Zodiac killer together? I mean, I would admit that it's possible. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities with this case based on just how little we have, how little we know about the Zodiac killer as a person and a personality. One of the things, though, I would say is, I mean, in terms of suspect eliminations, I'm really kind of deviating from any of the major suspects. Any of the major suspects we've talked about, I really don't find that anyone seems super convincing anymore. And we could possibly be dealing with a group murder. Once again, multiple people coming together, maybe two, maybe three. Perhaps only one person is writing the letters and the ciphers. I would stand by that. But the issue is, maybe it's somebody that is not even on the big radar. Maybe it is somebody that is not even on like the kind of top 10 list. Once again, 1,500 suspects. We've probably covered maybe 12 of them on this channel, like 12 brand new suspects. A list of 1,500? Well, that's the needle in the flippin' haystack, by the definition of it. Goodness gracious. And I was just like, if we were to cover one suspect a day, 365 days a year, how many years would that take for us to go through that entire list? It's like, this is something that it's not only difficult. Once you add in the possibility that you could be looking at two people planning the Zodiac stuff, you could look at 2 or 3 people committing these Zodiac actions, and they're trying to all pass it off as one person. Not to mention, some people have promoted that this could be kind of like purposely done as sort of a hoax, that people are kind of creating the Zodiac killer as a way to just kind of build up publicity for the San Francisco Chronicle. I'd like to explore that theory a little bit more as well, and we can kind of just investigate and see where that takes us. But, I mean, I don't personally subscribe to that, but we can learn a little more about it. Now, I think we're going to have to probably leave it at there soon, but what I would say is that, what do you think about the inconsistent behavior in the Zodiac killer? What do you think about all the different methods? What do you think about all the different kind of approaches that the Zodiac killer was using? And do you believe the Kathleen Johns incident was genuine Zodiac activity?